listeners from outside for this talk on the Mahabharata as India's first anthropology project. This is an extension, in a way, of yesterday's talk on the Ramayana, the journey of the journey. And I will begin with some similar caveats to situate the problem. What we would like to discuss as part of this course, which basically deals with the coming together, the construction, the elaboration of Indian civilization, in which no doubt these two great epics of India, and this has been said by any number of scholars, both Indian and non-Indian ones, no doubt contributed immensely to that process of integration. So yesterday I said, and I will repeat briefly, that these are not only pan-Indian texts, they are also pan-Asian. Their presence left a very strong mark on the whole cultural landscape of Asia, but as we will see with the concluding slide today, much beyond sometimes. So these are texts which do not age. They remain very present with us. There are, constantly new adaptations, new novels, new comics, new dramas, new performing arts focusing on these epics. So this is something very remarkable in the history of world literature. And there is something more which is quite remarkable, which I would like to now develop from the point of view of the Mahabharata, which is pretty much the same phenomenon as what we saw yesterday with Ramayana, but on a very different scale. And one or two things happening are quite new compared to the Ramayana. Before I start, excuse me, let me repeat that we are not concerned here with the question of historicity, whether the events, for example, the Great War, portrayed in the epics did occur in our world or not. This is not our concern. It's a very big issue, which is, anyway impossible to clinch ultimately, because we find excellent scholars on both sides of the fence, and unless one day there is some extremely spectacular unambiguous archaeological evidence, we will continue to debate this question. So this is not our problem here. Yesterday I said that the problem of the date of the Ramayana did not concern us, but as far as the date of the Mahabharata as a text, we will deal with it a little bit today from peripheral angles. So this is kind of built into the whole phenomenon which I'm going to deal with, this anthropology project, as I call it. So let me begin with, in fact, as I did yesterday, the geographic setting. So incidentally, a lot of art was produced as a result of these epics, including wonderful painted manuscripts, which, as I called them yesterday, are kind of proto-Amarcita Katha. Of course, they have a lot more text also. So let us have a look at the geographical setting, except that today I call it geopolitical, because in the Mahabharata, and this is a departure from the Ramayana, there is a entanglement of the geography and the politics, the whole setup of kingdoms, of janas, as we will see, people, ethnic populations, and so on. So they are all localized, and the two go together. We cannot really separate them. And this was studied very early on by scholars, even right in the 19th century, but the best early study undoubtedly was that of Parjita, who was a British official in India, and if I remember well, he was IKS, and he spent a lot of his spare time exploring Indian historical traditions, in particular these two texts, Mahabharata and Ramayana, and the Puranas. And in fact, he wrote one of the best books, even today, still very much consulted, on Indian historical traditions reconstructed from the Puranas. And his belief was that there was a lot of valid historical data in those texts, of course transformed, mixed with a considerable amount of mythology, no doubt, but nevertheless, um, data which could be, with some care, extracted from those texts. And he tried. He tried in particular to reconstruct all the dynasties of early historical India based on the Puranas and the Mahabharata and Ramayana. So extremely interesting, important work, very rigorous. Of course, today's scholars sometimes have improved or brought in some more perspectives, but still very much consulted. And here, what he does is that he revisits all the kingdoms, what he calls the nations, of India, and the different clans, and who is siding with the Pandavas and who sides with the Kauravas. So without going too much into details, this is a map which he gives in his paper, and I'm going to show you enlarged halves of it, the northern half and the southern half. But basically, this is purely extracted from Mahabharata. There is no modern data here, absolutely nothing. And he places on the map as per the descriptions which are available in the text itself. This is an aspect which we're not used to, pay much attention to, and yet it is one of the most concrete foundations for the whole text and its tapestry, if I may say so. There is a kind of a chronology problem here, because it so happens that the early historical period of India, as it is called by historian, that is to say, the period when literature happens. This is the beginning of history, when we have literary sources, texts, inscriptions a little later. So that period is reasonably well known and well explored. And if we want to put all these kingdoms on a chronological framework, then even though Professor Dilip Chakrabarty, whom I quote here, a very respected archaeologist, would like to have it in 800 BC, because of the presence of southern kingdoms, which I'm coming to in a few seconds, I think we would have to be more conservative and say that this map is compatible with the political map of India about 400 BC. So this is a very important clue to the setting of the text. But once again, let me use the comparison I used yesterday. It doesn't mean anything as far as the actual events are concerned. Again, I may be a novelist taking Kolkata or any part of India as my backdrop, and giving a reasonably faithful, but sometimes also perhaps sometimes a little fanciful description of that backdrop. The backdrop is real mostly, but whatever plot of the novel I choose may have no reality at the same time. So we have to be careful to distinguish these various elements of the story. Now, let us have a look at the northern part of Pajita's map. And you can see some names that we are still quite familiar with. For example, let me for example, here you see Gandhara. The highlighter is not working. All right. You can see Gandhara here. You can see Kaikeya, from where Kaikeyi, the protagonist, the queen in Ramayana, originated. You can see Kuru, Kosala, and Panchal, and also a lot of other central Indian kingdoms, like Matsya, for example, which are absolutely central to the plot of the Panchalis here. of the whole Mahabharata. But even though the main events take place here, we have a lot of descriptions of other regions, other parts, which play a very important role. Like we will come back to that. Pragjyotisha, for example, Kirata further east. Technically, this means the land of the hunters, and there are more Kiratas because it's not always, so precisely localized. Then where we stand, where I speak from today, which is Gujarat, IIT Gandhinagar, we have Anarta, which is an ancient name for a good chunk of Gujarat, and so on. And we have Kosala, but also Dakshina Kosala, and so on. So this is an important confirmation that the authors of the text are aware of the geography, not only of North India, but also of the South. And here we have Vidarbha, which is, of course, a region still so named in eastern Maharashtra. We have Kosala, sometimes associated with Odisha, and then Kalinga, Andhra, and Dravida, as you can see. Pandya, Chola, those names do occur in Mahabharata, as well as Malaya, as you can see, and even Kerala. So all these words are borrowed from the text. They are not a posteriori. And therefore, if we look at this totality of the Indian map, and here I'm going to use a nicely summed up map prepared by Professor K.S. Valia, renowned geologist who passed away unfortunately a few months ago, and it is more convenient for us to look at. And you can see that there is deliberately an intention. That is what matters to us today. There is an intention in the text of describing and integrating the whole of the subcontinent, and possibly even beyond, even regions that would correspond to Tibet, for example. So, and of course, some of them today are in technically Afghanistan, but Afghanistan was often part of the Indian sphere, even political, under the Mauryas. So there is a clear intention, and it would be unrealistic to assume that all these kingdoms actually took part in a war localized here in Kuru Panchala, in this heartland where the whole plot unfolds. I don't think that would be a very realistic assumption. And yet that is what the text says. So there is an intention. That intention is what we should keep in mind. Now, when we turn to archaeology, and first of all, before archaeology, let's have a look at history, because history confirms the existence of 16 Mahajanapadas. Mahajanapada, literally speaking, means big territory. So states, proto-states perhaps, but entities that have a political reality. And 16 of them are listed in early Buddhist texts, and most of them are also mentioned either by Panini or Patanjali or other authors. And their historical reality is not in question. And most of them, like Kuru, Panchala, Kosala, Anga, I did not show you, Gandhara, etc., are actually present in the Mahabharata. So we have a confirmation here that this landscape is not fanciful, and that the authors are quite familiar with the geography of India. And if we look at excavated sites, archaeological sites, then again, quite a few of them appear in the story, like Takshashila, like, of course, Hastinapura and Atranjikera, Mathura, and so on. Shringverpur appears in the Ramayana. This is where Rama, Sita, Lakshmana crossed the Ganga, helped by the Nishad king Guha, as we saw yesterday, and so on. So many of these cities, Ujjain certainly, appear in the text. And the same with central India and even south, though there the cities are not mentioned. It is only the names of the kingdoms that appear. So, so this is, look at the geography and some of the political units to which we will briefly return. Now, one thing is remarkable in Mahabharata, and this was pointed out by a number of scholars, including the Indologist Schaffer in the 1950s, and I'll use some of his data shortly, is that there is not only a deliberate attempt to integrate the whole geography and all the kingdoms, but also the people, the ethnic groups of India listed very systematically in the text. And this is something which does not happen in Ramayana. Of course, a few groups are appearing here and there. And as I said yesterday, they are often much more mythologized, for example, as Rakshasa, as demons of various kinds. So here, this is not the case. We have a very clear description on an extremely diverse society which speaks many languages. I will not dilate on this today. It is well known, and the text is aware that not all these people speak the same language. Diverse cultures, regional cultures, of course, diverse rulers and regions. But what is remarkable is that there is an actual listing of no less than 363 janas or jatis. I'll come to the difference. And this is something which is unexpected because, again, it would not be realistic to assume that all of them took part in a particular story together at the same time. Yet that's what the text wants us to believe, wants us to follow. So a jana, first of all, is simply a unit of people. It's very precisely what the Anthropological Survey of India listed as communities in their massive project, the People of India, conducted in the 1980s and 90s, perhaps even a bit earlier. And as I said yesterday, directed by Dr. K.S. Singh and published in at least 27 massive volumes. So 4,700 people of India were listed recently in the last decades, but they are exactly corresponding to this unit of jana. Jati is something a bit different. It can be, though that accuracy is not so reliable in the text, and sometimes the two terms are slightly interchangeable. Here, it's often a group of janas. For example, the Kiratas, whom I mentioned earlier, and they are basically forest dwellers, hunters. There are one, I'm sorry, it is the other way down. There are one jana and they have several jatis within that jana. So these are segments of a jana. What is extremely important, and I repeat myself from yesterday, but this has to be repeated because many of our modern readers fall under the colonial concept of tribe, and we see that concept used without any discernment in still a lot of scholarly work today. The epic, and this was pointed out by K.S. Singh in particular, does not distinguish between caste and tribe, or if you prefer, between mainstream and non-mainstream. They are all janas, that's all. They are all groups of people. And as I said, the only description of tribes, because there is no word for tribe in Sanskrit. It does not exist. The word Adivasi was created in the 1920s by Europeans. And it's a pity that we use it quite indiscriminately today and we give it a legal status. It is not a good term. It's a misleading term because there is no guarantee that Adivasis are always Adi. There is no guarantee that non-Adivasis may not be Adi, and ultimately Adi doesn't mean much. So anyway, I close this parenthesis for now, and we will simply remember, as K.S. Singh said, that there is hardly any evidence to show that in the collective consciousness of India, there is any difference between the two sets of janas. That is to say, the mainstream or caste and the outside the mainstream, like the forest dwellers and the mountain dwellers, which is how those texts describe tribals by their environment. So I mentioned Shaffer, and here is he meticulously sifted through the entire Mahabharata, and he finds that these janas are um, uh, they come into the picture through different angles, through different contexts. So one is geography, and 231, I will let you read those numbers, come up as part of geographical lists where the texts describe all the regions. Then, as you may remember, Yudhishthira sends his 4 brothers to conquer, as part of a large Ashwamedha sacrifice, to conquer all directions of the subcontinent. In fact, in the text it says of the world, but we understand that the world in those texts usually refers to the subcontinent. So this is known as the Digvijaya episode of the Mahabharata, and there 212 janas will be listed as encountered by the 4 Pandavas in their path of conquest. During the war, some will pay tribute to people will pay tribute to the Pandavas to help them in various ways during and before the war too, and that's almost 300. Then we have those actually participating in the war on one side or the other, and that's another 158. So of course, it doesn't add up, you might notice, to 363 because there's a large overlap. Many janas appear in several of these lists, and various other miscellaneous data or situations when one or another jana may happen. So how are they defined? In different ways. They can be defined geographically, so pinpoint on the map, and the map is that of Jambudvipa. The subcontinent is called Jambudvipa in Mahabharata, which is a term that Ashoka, for example, uses also in his edicts when he wants to refer to India. There are more terms, but this is quite common. Of course, Bharata also will become a common term later. So, but not all regions are equal, and the Kuru Panchala, which is, as I said, the heartland with Matsya of the whole story, is regarded as holier than others, and therefore people inhabiting those regions also. Political units, Janapadas we saw, Varsha and Rashtras, which refer more to established kingdoms. And also in ecological terms, this is very important. People living in mountains. So these are what we call today tribals, or near rivers, or like the Saindhava near the Sindhu, or in deserts or pastoral lands. And then you have those in the east, in the north, in the west, in the south, or in the northwest. So these are very long lists, and the epic proceeds very methodically to convincing us that this whole vibrant ethnological tapestry is the whole backdrop of the story, and it's deeply woven into the story, and therefore they are not interpolations, as some scholars initially thought, that people added later on into the text more janas, but there is no reason to assume that. They are part of the whole story from beginning to end. So casing again, the Mahabharata notion of jana, or people of a territory, still endures, and this is very important for us to better understand India. People continue to identify themselves with the epic traditions, associate places with the visits of the epic heroes. I'll give a few examples in a little later. And to recall people's own role in the growing and developing epic traditions. That is to say, how my ancestors participated in the Great War, for example, or in some episode, major or minor, of this story. And he says, this may be bad history. You see, as from a strictly historical point of view, it may not hold. I may not be able to prove any of those claims, but it is good myth, and myth in a cultural sense of a cultural construct that gives meaning to human life, and also attaches it to something bigger. But it is good myth and therefore good anthropology. So here we see in a humorous but deep way at the same time how history and anthropology deal with very, very different spheres of human activity and human culture. Anthropologists are not concerned whether a particular legend, mythology, may have some historical roots or not. It may or it may not, it makes no difference to them. So now there is another phenomenon which is distinct from the Ramayana in the Mahabharata. And it is that, yes, there is sacred geography attached to Mahabharata quite a lot, and I'm not going to give long lists, which would be easy to do. But instead, I want to reflect more on the fact that Mahabharata itself includes sacred geography. And this is something which is very much part of the Purana tradition. The Puranas, all of them, and this is one of their almost, the features of the template that they follow. Almost all Puranas describe tirthas, sacred sites, and how much punya you're going to earn by visiting here or going there or traveling to that particular tirtha, and at what period of the year, and so on. So this is well known, but Mahabharata follows this template, which Ramayana does not, and creates networks of tirthas, of pilgrimage sites. So, for example, we have a lot of lists given by various sages, even by Narada also, the semi-divine emissary of the gods, who likes to play mischief by coming into human scenarios and usually revealing some predictions that are going to cause those predictions to happen. Anyway, Narada is also very fond of pilgrimages and tirthas, and in the text, in Mahabharata, he gives to the Pandavas a lot of lists of places that they should visit, and they do. So there are various tirtha yatras or pilgrimages, and one of them is that of Arjuna. You may remember the story. Arjuna inadvertently or under some compulsion of rescuing someone who was attacked, had to enter the room of Yudhishthira while he was with Draupadi to collect his weapons. And this was something that they had agreed among all the 5 brothers should never happen. So as a penance, to atone for this, he goes on a pilgrimage. So it's a very convenient device that the text improvises. I found this map. I'm not sure, I could not find its author, and it may or may not be very precise. In fact, it's not always possible to reach absolute precision from the text, but here certainly the red dots are mentioned in the text as sites which Arjun visits during his pilgrimage, starting from this region and going first to the Himalayas, and then circumambulating much of northern and central India. And as he proceeds, we visit with him a lot of sacred spots, a lot of ashramas, a lot of places of worship, which are very important in India's sacred geography. So this is quite something which we do not find in Ramayana. And the fact that the sacred geography does not happen outside of the text, but first of all within the text itself. There is also, among other examples we could give, the pilgrimage of Balarama along the Sarasvati. What is that pilgrimage? It is quite simply that Balarama, if you remember, refuses to fight in the Great War. He doesn't want to take sides. Whereas Krishna allows himself to, to lead the Pandavas while his armies are helping the Kauravas. But Balarama does not want to fight. And he, during the Great War, what he does is that he does this pilgrimage, starting from Prabhas in Gujarat, which is, there is a name by a place by this name even today, close to Somnath. He follows the course of the Sarasvati river, which is pretty much this segment of Arjuna's pilgrimage also. And as he proceeds, first of all, the river is broken up, it disappears under the desert from time to time. This is an indication that the Saraswati had started disintegrating at that time. If we can, take any chronological angle, and he goes all the way, but not exactly here. He will deviate into what is today Haryana and land somewhere here in the Shivaliks, where the source of the Saraswati is traditionally located. So this is a long and interesting pilgrimage with, again, a lot of descriptions of the ashrams and all the Vedic chanting and Vedic rituals that take place there. So therefore, the moral of the story is simply that we have a new concept here compared to the Ramayana, which does confirm that Ramayana should be looked at as an older text, at least in its conception, if not in its execution. Let me now spend a little time on 3 parts of India. And here I will be mixing everything: legends, inscriptions, sacred geography, because I want to take a geographical angle here for a simple reason that these are 3 parts which in recent decades, and let us not go into politics, but the fact is that all 3 of them at some point or another have claimed to be separate from India and have wanted to separate from India. So and one of the reasons often brandished is that they have a completely different culture, they have no connection with India, and so on and so forth. So I will deal with the South. Of course, that sense of separateness was always weak there and has thankfully disappeared. But I will also deal with Kashmir, and I will deal with the Northeast. So let us have a look at the South. And there, exactly as K.S. Singh was mentioning, we find not only as we saw, those dynasties mentioned in the Mahabharata, but we find, and also mention of a Pandya king fighting on the side of the Pandava. But we find, on the other hand, actual historical kings, Chora and Cheras, proudly claiming descent from one of the 2 dynasties. You may remember that the Sona dynasty or Surya Vamsha is the dynasty of Rama, while the lunar dynasty, Chandra Vamsha, is that of Krishna. So by saying that I belong to this dynasty or another, it means I'm attaching myself either to Rama or to Krishna. And of course, these are mythological claims. They have 0 validity from a strictly historical point of view, especially because whatever date we would like to give, if at all we want to Mahabharata's events, we would be many centuries before these particular kings. So the historicity is not even to be considered. But again, it is this phenomenon of cultural attachment, cultural. It's a device that allows them to attach themselves to a greater story which they identify with India. And in this case, of course, it's a story from North India. There's no doubt at all that Mahabharata is a North Indian story, and yet they want to attach themselves to it and become part of it. There is even an inscription from a Pandya king that he says he led the elephant force in the Great War on behalf of the Pandavas. So this is also totally ahistorical. And also a claim that the early Pandyas translated the Mahabharata into Tamil. If it is true, there's no way to cross-check, then the translation was lost, which would be very unfortunate. And then there is also Chera King. So the Cheras, as you may remember, are slightly to the west of the Pandya kingdom and possibly encompass much of what is today Kerala. They claim to have sumptuously fed the armies on both sides during the Bharata war, which is a very big claim since the armies are numbered in millions and millions of soldiers. So these are, you know, simply, as I said, cultural devices. Another cultural device is sacred geography. And we have a lot of landmarks in the south. Near Kodaikanal, there are caves which are called locally Panchapandavar Pare. Pare means a rock. And this is where the five Pandavas came and stayed. There are numerous shrines to Draupadi in Tamil Nadu and Kerala. She is extremely popular in Tamil Nadu in particular. And lots of popular ballads, some of which occurs in manuscripts. In fact, one scholar, Manavalan, who passed away some years ago, before he passed away, he conducted an extensive village-to-village survey of Tamil Nadu. And he counted about 100 versions, popular versions, folk versions of the Mahabharata, which still existed. So this would have been sometime in the 1980s and 90s. So 100 versions for Tamil Nadu alone, you can realize the density of the penetration of the text and the way in which it has been adopted by all the people. And then from the 9th century, this is a very important development, we have inscriptions that record the grants of revenue, lands, for poets and discourse scholars on Mahabharata. You will recognize here the Harikatha tradition, which I mentioned yesterday with regard to Ramayana. It is the same here, of course. And these are scholars. Initially, it would have occurred very informally. There would not have been any institutionalization of this phenomenon. But now we see that they receive patronage. They receive royal patronage. And the rulers are encouraging these scholars to go about and spread these stories. So this is one of the mechanisms by which those stories penetrated so deeply. And this is a photo of a hero stone found very close to a place where I lived for more than 2 decades. It is Banagudi Shola in the Nilgiris near Kotagiri, which we did visit, but we could not take a photo. This is taken from a book because there was a festival going on at that time, and it is deep in a forest. And deep in that forest, there is a small shrine, no bigger than about 2 meters by 2 meters. And within that shrine, there is this hero stone worshipped and maintained by Irula tribals, what we call tribals today. And you can see here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Pandavas and something of their life episodes. I wish I could go back and take a proper photo being depicted. Now, this is remarkable because, like that rock near Kodaikanal, it tells us of the passage of the Pandavas here. This is, of course, not historical, cannot be, but it means that, again, we want those great heroes to have come here. And there is hardly any traditional spot or region in India where someone did not pass. If you look carefully, you will have one of those heroes. You will have Rama himself, perhaps. Very often in the north, you will have Bhishma. You will have Hanuman. Anyone can pass and does pass. And sometimes rishis also, Agastya, for example. A lot of these traveling characters crisscross India, as it were, and leave their footprints everywhere in ways which are not always very consistent. As I said, you have many Valmiki ashrams, many Agastya ashrams in India, and that does not matter in the least. In the northeast, let me move a little more briefly. there are many landmarks again, and we spoke of the Kiratas already, which could correspond to the tribal communities established in the Northeast over the centuries. So the word Prag-Jyotisha, which means, where the light is primordial, that is to say, the East, where the light comes from, was in the text founded by Naraka, who is, of course, also an Asura, and his son Bhagadatta, and who intervenes in the epic as a character fighting Arjuna. But there is also a historical Bhagadatta king in the northeast, and he is mentioned in inscriptions, in particular in a seal found at Nalanda. But then there are other elements of the story where Arjuna goes to Manipura and tries to placate the Nagas. In the process, he picks up a wife, Ulupi. All this is well known. But in addition, in Assam, there are traditions associating Bhima's son, Hidimba, with the whole region, the whole kingdom. So all these traditions are still quite alive. The Bodos, as we mentioned earlier, also identify themselves to these stories. It's interesting that there is a separatist Bodo movement, and yet the cultural connections are quite strong. And once again, K.S. Singh remarked, if the Bodos have a view of their relationship with pan-Indian traditions, this cannot be described as something imaginary. Historically, it may not be valid, but yet it is not imaginary. It has to be seen as people's effort to link with historical traditions. Perhaps he could have said with mythologized history. And Ajay Mitra Shastri, the great epigraphist, who also historian of ancient India, wrote ancient Pragjyotisha, or the Northeast, had very intimate relations with the rest of India, of which it was an integral component geographically and culturally, despite its own distinctive culture and physical elements. And this can be said with many, borderline regions of India, including Kashmir. Kashmir is hardly borderline. In fact, I should not apply this word to Kashmir. It is totally integral to India, as Professor Shonalika Kaur demonstrated in her book on the early history of Kashmir. And again, there is a semi-mythologized history found in Raja Tarangini of Kalhana, which connects ultimately to the Mahabharata. Krishna also is part of the legends there. He helps the queen Yashovati to ascend the throne. And there are numerous relations, traditions, landmarks connecting to folk versions of the text. There is also a Naga worship, a tradition of Naga worship. And it's interesting because Naga worship is also extremely strong in the Northeast, of course. Consider Nagaland, for example. But here in Kashmir, there was also a Naga tribe. And here also, Arjuna came and married Udupi in Kashmir. So you can see that, once again, as I remarked yesterday, accuracy is not the point. The point is, what is the intention, what happens, and what is the result of these people seeking those connections. And also tribal worship of the Pandavas, of Bhima very often, and Draupadi being an Ishta Devata among some of them. So let me now try to reach a conclusion. We could amplify all these features very easily and create long lists, and it has been done. Those books have been written. I just attempted to give you a more bird's eye view of these somewhat neglected aspects of the epics. We spend much more energy on trying to prove that they were historical or semi-historical, or trying to prove that they belong to one date or another. And actually, these are perhaps not the most important questions. I realize, nevertheless, and I want to make an apology here, that I forgot to mention when I was showing those maps of excavated sites at the beginning, I should have mentioned the name of Professor Bibilal, because he's one of those who pursued from the 1970s onward, an ambitious project of excavating sites connected with Ramayana on Mahabharata. The connection was quite simply the name. The name, for example, we saw Shringavirpur, or we saw Mathura, or we saw Hastinapura. And since the names are mentioned, whether, of course, they are identical with the locations in the epics, will remain difficult to establish. But let us assume that this is the case. His approach was to examine the material cultures present in those sites and to find a kind of common denominator for the Ramayana sites and for the Mahabharata sites. And he did find one. He found, strangely and counterintuitively, that the Mahabharata sites often reached to more ancient times. And his, chronological bottom line was about 1200 BC, painted grey ware culture, as the name goes. Whereas for Ramayana, it was a later culture which could be dated to approximately 800 or 700 BC. So this was an attempt which was sound from a scholarly point of view. Nevertheless, I'm well aware that it has been criticized by other archaeologists who said that even though there are common cultures in all these sites, and this was to be expected in a way, still to establish that they relate directly to the epic, or that the events of the epic were actual events, still remains a tall order. So Professor Bibilal wrote two very nice books on these two texts, which I would refer you to if you are interested in this question. And he presented further counter arguments and tried to trace all the early history of those texts in the Indian context, from not only archaeology but also the point of view of epigraphy and even art history. So it's a very interesting study, and I want to salute him not only because he recently was awarded Padma Vibhushan, but also because he will turn 100 years old this year and still continues to work on Indian archaeology. Now, I would like to conclude here by this why and how, which I briefly explored yesterday. How do we, first of all, why are these texts trying to create something, trying to integrate this whole region? There is a concern, there is an intention, as I said. And clearly, there is a desire to create a tapestry for the whole of India, for the whole of the subcontinent, which, as I said, will sometimes extend way beyond, but that was perhaps not part of the original intention. It just happened. So there is a desire, and these two texts did their job magnificently. The impact on India has been, continues to be immense, and I don't think any other text comes close to the kind of impact they've had. So this is as far as we can probe the why. The how is complex, as complex as the texts themselves. And the how is that there are different devices at work. First of all, in the text, we see alliances between kingdoms quite a lot through marriage. And there is also a desire to connect kingdoms together. This is one of the devices. Of course, political alliances as well as through marriage. Then there is the Harikatha tradition, which I have said enough about. And there is also this extraordinary freedom given to all regions, languages, ethnic groups to own the text. And once you own them, you have freedom to adopt, adapt, transpose, translate, transcreate them, and basically do what you want with them. And this is what happened exactly. We have altogether thousands of retellings, of recreations in different literary forms and art forms. And then this device of sacred geography. But I think most of all, and these are some of the factors that we discussed with our students last Monday, most of all, the nature of the dramas, their intensity, the vastness of the plot, the complexity, richness of the plot, and the pathos, the whole canvas of human emotions that they cover, from love to treachery, from loss and separation to reunion, and the whole gamut. So this is something where we can all find something that will move us and that we can easily connect to. And we can connect also with the heroes. The protagonists are luckily imperfect, and they are always portrayed as such. They have also their emotions, they have their weaknesses, they have their jealousies, they have their limitations. They have sometimes even a bit of cowardliness, if you remember the stories of Mahabharata. So this is something which the text is very intent upon, not to portray the heroes as perfect characters, because if they are too perfect, we're not going to identify with them. You know, they will be almost like gods, and gods are a little too far away. We can worship them, we can revere them, whatever, but we cannot easily identify with them. So this I think are among the few factors which explain how these two texts became so interwoven with India and beyond. And I will end by leaving India now for this quotation and looking at what happened in the 19th century in Europe, and this is in France. The text started being translated, of course, at first in much shorter versions, and they had a terrific impact in the literary world, especially with the Romantic movement in Europe. Perhaps it was short-lived, but it remained, something of it remained present and was still discussed later by a number of literary figures in the 20th century. So Jules Michelet, the French historian who wrote massively on French history in the 19th century, and he was one of the leaders of the Romantic movement, discovered those two texts and was absolutely enthralled by them. So this is what he writes. India, closer than us to the creation, has better preserved the tradition of universal brotherhood. She inscribed at the beginning and at the end of her two sacred poems, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, gigantic pyramids before which our small occidental works must stand humbly and respectfully. When you grow tired of this quarrelsome West, please indulge in the sweet return to your mother, to that majestic antiquity so noble and tender. Love, humility, grandeur, you will find it all gathered there, and with such simple feelings, so detached of all miserable pride, that humility never even needs a mention. So there is a lot more, praise that we could quote from a number of Western scholars, and I think this is a central factor in this creation of Indian civilization. If we remove these two texts, we are definitely not dealing with the same civilization. So this was my intention in these two talks, and I hope I was able to illustrate how these texts functioned at certain levels, that we do not always, blinded by this great plot that Michelet praises here, we do not always consider those very pragmatic, down-to-earth aspects which I focused upon. With this, I will stop for today.